Thank you all for coming along to today's presentation on the first of our treaty papers, which is on the foundations and scope of the Victorian Treaty. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which I sit today, which is I'm on Wurundjeri country today. From a brief look at the attendees, I see that we're probably spread across Victoria, if not different parts of Australia. So I'd just like to acknowledge that we all reside on stolen and unceded lands. Just to commence with the presentation. So what we're presenting today is a discussion paper. It's part of a series of discussion papers that the Federation has prepared on issues to do with treaty. The purpose of these papers, we should probably just make clear, we're not suggesting that these papers represent the positions of the Federation or of any traditional owners. Instead, really what these are is just discussion pieces around issues that are going to be arising during the treaty process in Victoria. The main aim of these papers is really, I think, to start to put forward concrete propositions around treaty. Treaty has obviously been a discussion that the Aboriginal community has been having for at least a generation. But now I think is really the time to move from rhetoric to practice. So we have to start thinking, you know, what does sovereignty look like? What does Aboriginal control of Aboriginal affairs look like? And that's what these series of papers really try and put forward, is propositions about how that might really become a practical reality. So there's 6 papers in total. The first today is Understanding the Landscape, the Foundations and Scope of the Victorian Treaty. So today we're really trying to get a feel for the current Aboriginal political space in Victoria and how that might be incorporated into treaty going forward, and then to sort of try and scope out what we think that might look like in practice. Our second paper is on sovereignty in the Victorian context. We'll be presenting on that in a few weeks on the 10th of February. The third paper is on UN DRIP and enshrining Aboriginal rights. That will be presented on the 3rd of March. All of these papers are currently available on our website. If you want to go down and read these, you're more than welcome to. And please join us on those dates, and we'll be presenting on them. The following papers, the Aboriginal Control of Aboriginal Affairs, a Framework for Traditional Owner Treaties, Lessons from the Settlement Act, and a final paper dealing with a comprehensive treaty model for Victoria, in which we'll try and bring all the pieces together in a sort of comprehensive piece. We will be presenting on these too, but we don't yet have dates, but we hope to sort of get through them in March and April. And we will have then presented on all our papers. So starting on today's paper, Understanding the Landscape and the Foundations and Scope of the Victorian Treaty. As I said, this paper really will focus on the current space and how that might be interpreted into a sort of treaty framework. I'll just, not knowing sort of the diversity of the audience we have and what level of engagement people have with the treaty space, just give a very brief overview of the Treaty Act. So of course, what I'm referring to there is the Advancing the Treaty Process with Aboriginal Victorians Act 2018. And very briefly, what this act does is it empowers the state and the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria to design and negotiate 4 treaty structures. The first of those treaty structures is a negotiation framework. The second is a treaty authority, which is often spoken about as it'll be essentially a neutral third party that will act as an umpire in treaty negotiations, and also a self-determination fund and a dispute resolution process. Now, our papers, with respect to these treaty structures, our papers tend to focus on the big picture or the overall treaty model, what that might look like. So to that extent, we're not really focused on the treaty structures. with the exception of the framework. We focus almost exclusively on the framework because we suggest it's going to be crucial for all future treaties and will likely define all future treaties. And for that reason, it's the place to have a discussion about what the big picture might look like. Now, before I sort of get down into the weeds of this paper, it probably is helpful to provide you with a bit of an overview of the big picture as we see it, and the proposed model that we will be exploring during this series of papers. So the first component of our model is one thing I think is important to realise before we get into the discussion is that treaty really does provide us a new lens through which we can explore Aboriginal and settler relations, and that's of equal sovereign entities freely entering into agreement. So with our model, what we're trying to do, we're trying to look beyond the current limitations of Aboriginal affairs, and we are trying to think big, and trying to think how some of the concepts that have been put forward by the Aboriginal community over a long period of time, things like recognition of their sovereignty, can be incorporated into a system. So the first component is, we would say, of our model is the establishment of the treaty representative body, or the TRB. We see this as an elected body representing traditional owners and possibly all Aboriginal Victorians. And it won't be the Assembly, but it might be an extension of the Assembly, or an evolution of the Assembly into something like the treaty representative body. This body would then enter into a statewide treaty, a treaty covering the entire state with the state government. When we go forward through the paper, you'll note that we don't differentiate a whole lot between the framework and the statewide treaty. We say that that it can be hard to differentiate between what is appropriately called a framework and what is appropriately called a statewide treaty. So keep that in mind, but we are suggesting that the framework be adopted as a statewide treaty. What would be included in this treaty is firstly that the TRB would be recognised as a sovereign body. It would be a collaboration of traditional owner nations, each with their own individual sovereignty, essentially federating together to provide a larger sovereign body in sort of the same way the Australian colonies came together to create the Commonwealth. But of course, each traditional owner nation would retain its own local sovereignty as well. The TRB as a sovereign body would need appropriate powers. We would suggest that could be legislative power, that is power to make its own laws over certain subject matter. We see international examples of that in British Columbia, where some First Nation parliaments essentially have legislative power, or in Scandinavia. It could operate as a voice to the Victorian Parliament, or it could have reserved seats in the Victorian Parliament. It could have one of these things, or a combination of all of these three. The second component of the statewide treaty would be Aboriginal control of Aboriginal affairs, which would essentially see all government departments and statutory authorities that currently involve themselves in Aboriginal affairs being devolved to the control of the TRB, and of course the bureaucracy transferring with those powers. The third component would be recognition of Aboriginal rights, and this would really be entrenching the UN DRIP in law and making the UN DRIP justiciable, so that the laws would be able to be enforced through the courts and develop with the common law over time. The final component of the statewide treaty would be a framework for local treaties. We don't suggest that the statewide treaty is going to satisfy the calls for traditional owner nations to have their sovereignty recognised, and that sovereignty would also need to be recognised on country. What that framework might look like would need to be collectively negotiated with traditional owner groups or nations. But at a minimum, it would be an improvement on the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, and would be a recognition of sovereignty. So that's the overall paper. That's where we're headed. And now I'll dive into the paper itself. But before I do so, I will just point out the structure of this. I hope to sort of finish this up at about 45 minutes, leaving us about 15 or 10 minutes for questions and answers. But if at any time people want to dive in with a question, please feel free to just turn on your mic and do so, or put something in the question and answers chat box. All right, so overview of paper one. So the paper is really split into three sections. The first section, as I indicated, will deal with the current landscape of Aboriginal affairs. What we're trying to do is identify the political spaces in which Aboriginal people are currently active and represented, and we think this is probably the best starting point to start to conceive of what an eventual treaty might look like. In the second part, we'll start to examine the concept of the framework itself. We're going to look at some practical examples of how frameworks are used in Canada, in British Columbia in their modern treaty process, and also how they're used in Victoria under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. Our conclusion there really is that these frameworks mould agreement terms, and so much so that it can become difficult to differentiate between where the framework ends and the treaty begins. And in the third section, we'll put forward a proposal for the framework itself. As I said, we suggest that might be actually adopted as a statewide treaty, and we will start to look at how the aspirations of Aboriginal and traditional owner groups might be brought within that model, which I've just brought you through. So, talking about the current landscape in Aboriginal affairs, as I said, we're trying to identify the political spaces in which Aboriginal people are already active. Obviously, having a discussion of that kind, it's impossible to capture everything, but we think you can largely break it down into sort of three broad categories of Aboriginal organisations that are both represent Aboriginal interests and afforded some level of recognition with the state. The first, of course, is Aboriginal Community Controlled Organisations, or ACCOs, traditional owner groups, and lastly, consultative bodies. Consultative bodies being groups of traditional owners put together by the state, that the state will then consult when it's producing policy or legislation. So I assume most people are familiar with Aboriginal community controlled organisations. They're quite prominent in the Victorian space. Their essential purpose really, I suppose, is to provide Aboriginal-led and controlled services over a really diverse range of areas. There's ACCOs that are dedicated to health, to law, housing, homeless outreach, and so on. Most of the ACCOs that are currently active in Victoria really arose out of the 1970s and the land rights movement of the 1970s, a period described as a political and cultural renaissance. And arising out of that space, although they are service providers, I think it's clear that ACCOs have been more than just service providers. Historically, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, they've been the most prominent Aboriginal controlled spaces, and they really became the focal point for community organisation. Also, a point of difference, I think, from the later models of representation that have evolved under traditional ownership. ACCOs really developed in a period where traditional ownership wasn't emphasised and was certainly de-emphasised by the state. And they're not traditional owner focused. They're open to all Aboriginal people, and they service all Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders. Just to give a sense of the breadths of some of the ACCOs in Victoria, here are some I'm sure that many of us are familiar with, covering a whole range of services, and from the preservation and promotion of Aboriginal languages to family support services. ACCOs really do a whole range of wonderful work right across the space. Traditional owner groups, I'm sure we're also too familiar with the concept of traditional owner groups. I use that generic phrase, but what I mean to capture is First Nations, clan groups, however described, the political entities that occupied Victoria prior to invasion. Now, while ACCOs have been viewed historically as the vanguard of the rights movement, the post-Mabo era has really seen these other forms of political representation re-emerge. There's a photo of Eddie Mabo outside the court with his barristers in '91. And I think there's some irony in the fact that before Mabo, the state refused to recognise pre-invasion political structures at all. But following Mabo, that position has really been inversed. And what we're seeing more and more since the 90s and that decision is the state refocusing its lens on these traditional structures and starting to recognise them as the sort of preeminent way that Aboriginal people are represented, and in which Aboriginal rights are to be recognised. Now, although the Native Title Act and Mabo is no doubt hugely important, its impact in Victoria has been slightly mixed. This is because of the finding in the Yorta Yorta decision, where the High Court examined for the first time the elements required to prove the existence of native title. Among those elements, it found it was necessary to show traditional connection to the land that has been maintained substantially uninterrupted and in a continuous connection since contact. Now, in the southeastern states of Australia and in Victoria, of course, the colonial policy was to force removal from country, usually by violence, or at least the implicit threat of violence, breaking that connection. Now, what the court found in Yorta Yorta and subsequent decisions was the fact that that had been done against people's will, or even as a result of violence, was irrelevant. And once the connection is broken, native title rights are extinguished and they cannot be revived. So, I mean, I think Yorta Yorta was a kind of crucial turning point for Victorian traditional owners. I think the view at the time was that its impact meant that essentially Victorian traditional owners would be cut off from native title outcomes. That proved not to be the case. We now have 4 native title determinations in Victoria, but I think it did and continues to have an impact on how Victorian traditional owner groups seek recognition. It led to sort of ongoing activism from traditional owners about the injustice of that position, about the breaking of connection being a barrier. And the Victorian Parliament has responded, and there are now different forms of the formal recognition used in the state. Again, I'm using the term, so-called formal recognition. I know some people consider that a slightly, I suppose, insulting term, and I certainly agree in a sense. I use it only because the state uses it, and because it's just meant to indicate that it's a process through which a group can be recognised by the state as a formal political entity. So the methods of of so-called formal recognition available in Victoria. The first is under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. This allows the traditional owner group to apply to the Heritage Council and be appointed as a registered Aboriginal party, which will then provide them some rights in managing and protecting Aboriginal heritage. The second form is, of course, through the Native Title Act, through the Commonwealth legislation. And a traditional owner group engages that by filing a claim in the federal court and seeking the determination as to whether their rights continue to exist. This might occur with the consent of the state. Most often these processes these days, at least in Victoria, are done with the consent of the state. If the state can be brought along to agree that those rights will exist, it will do so, and there will be no need for a trial or a hearing. The third method is agreement under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. So this is an alternative to the Native Title Act. It's unique to Victoria. It's a process where a traditional owner group basically sits down and negotiates a settlement, which will provide the rights and interests in land which are comparable to the Native Title Act, and in some cases exceed what you would get under the Native Title Act. It also provides a financial package. A difference between the NTA and the Settlement Act is that the Settlement Act does not require evidence of continuous connection to country. So in effect, it's acknowledging the injustice of the order decision and also the impact of colonial policy on breaking connection to country. So each one of those forms of recognition involves acknowledgement by the state, or in the case of native title, the federal court, that the group are the traditional owners for a distinct area of land, and that they also meet a certain threshold of representative governance. The difference between them, though, is that each legislative regime will convey different rights and responsibilities. So if you are appointed a RAP, you obtain RAP status under the Victorian Heritage Act, you're provided a role in the oversight of cultural heritage. If heritage is going to be impacted by works or development, there's a process whereby the destruction or the harm can be avoided or minimised through the creation of a cultural heritage management plan, or a CHMP. The Native Title Act and the Settlement Act are slightly different in the nature of the rights they provide, because they recognise and enliven rights in the land itself. These will include rights of access to the land for traditional purposes, such as hunting and gathering. And if there is going to be any impact on those rights through development by government or third parties, that will give rise to further rights where the traditional owner group will have a right to be consulted, to negotiate an agreement, or in some cases receive compensation. Usually, those rights don't extend to a veto. That is, the traditional owner group does not have the ability to say no to the activity. So looking at Victoria, as I said, we have now 4 groups that have a determination under the Native Title Act, and we have 3 groups that have a Traditional Owner Settlement Act deal. One thing to also understand about the relationship between these bits of legislation is that if you obtain a native title determination or a traditional owner settlement agreement, you will automatically be appointed as the RAP under the Heritage Act. In that sense, the Native Title Act and the Settlement Act kind of trump the heritage legislation. The heritage legislation too is probably, well, I think definitely is much more accessible than the other two. And the general process seems to be, for groups that are going down this path, is that they'll apply for RAP status first, and sort of use that as a sort of threshold basis of recognition before moving on to one of the other 2 types. We currently have a total of 11 groups in Victoria that have RAP status. And of course, that number includes those with native title determinations or Settlement Act deals. You'll notice that the 11 groups corresponds to the 11 reserved seats on the Assembly, because the Assembly has used RAP status as the threshold to be eligible for a reserved seat. Now, it should also be noted that there are many groups in Victoria that have no type of recognition. There are certainly more than 11 traditional owner groups in Victoria. The reason why groups might not have this recognition is that they might be a political position. They might be opposed to seeking the recognition of the settler government. It might be a simple lack of resources. Right, onto the final component of what we see as the political space in Victorian Aboriginal affairs, and that is consultative bodies. So in recent years, the state has put considerable effort into establishing partnership structures and trying to get Aboriginal voices heard in policy development and allow for co-design. There's many avenues through which the state can consult or partner with Aboriginal Victorians, and we'll just look at two of them quickly. The first is local Aboriginal networks or LANs. These were set up in 2007. They're generalised consultative bodies. They're open to all Aboriginal community members. There's currently 39 operating across Victoria, and they're supported by 12 Aboriginal community development brokers. Obviously, that is quite an enterprise, and quite a lot of resources are put into that process. Because they're localised, LANs really can focus on different policy areas of their choosing. They currently have a 5-year plan that sets out priority areas as strengthening culture, economic participation, and so on. Quite broad areas that really almost anything would seem to be able to fall within the orbit of the LANs. The second type of consultative body we'll look at is the partnerships and structures that the state will set up when it's putting together strategies, agreements and plans for different areas of policy development. So the state will put together strategic plans for things like education, health and wellbeing, and they will try and do these in consultation with the Aboriginal community. Often these days, these plans are then styled as partnerships, as in partnering with the Aboriginal community. Sometimes they'll take the language even further, and they'll present the documents as agreements. They'll be essentially drawn up in the style of a contract, so it will look like a contract, and will even be signed by government ministers and by various ACCOs. There's an example there of the Victorian Aboriginal Justice Agreement, and you can see there it's described as a partnership between the Victorian government and Aboriginal community. Now, obviously, the Aboriginal community is not a legal entity, and these documents are not binding contracts in any sense, but they remain government policies. I think though the language is telling, and I think it does reflect an intention by the state to not only involve Aboriginal people in how these things are developed, but an intention at least to give an aspiration that they'll be held to account, and Aboriginal people will be able to measure the government's performance against them. But one thing I think that is clear, looking at the way the state does consult, is that there really is no overarching framework or strategy. You seem to have a whole bunch of lands, and then you have individual consultation on different bits of policy. I mean, that seems to me to create a situation where you're clearly going to have overlap, different groups being consulted on the same subject, and no clarity about how the state is privileging voices within those consultations. Also, the focus is still very much on consultation. The state will often put forward, or all governments will put forward, this idea that they're consulting as indicating how progressive they are, but ultimately it's inconsistent with the principles of self-determination. because the government will always retain the ability to accept or ignore any advice, and it's able to choose who it consults with. I think there is some recognition now in government that this is the case. If you look at the Victorian Affairs Aboriginal Framework, the VAF, their most recent sort of overall strategy for Aboriginal affairs, it includes this continuum towards Aboriginal self-determination. So that, you know, this is the idea that you start at sort of informing and consulting, moving towards collaboration, partnership and co-ownership, and ultimately self-determination is about decision-making and resource control. So looking at some of the language the states adopting in these so-called agreements, you can see that they're starting to adopt that language and move along this continuum. And hopefully treaty is the process that will take us from partnership and co-ownership to the transfer of decision-making and resource control. So that, I mean, in a sense, is a very brief look at sort of the Aboriginal political space made up of those three components: the ACCOs, traditional owners, and consultative bodies. I see I've got about 15 minutes left before we get on to the discussion portion. So I'll move on now to part 2, which will be starting to think about the framework itself, the framework that the Assembly and the state are required to negotiate under the Treaty Act, and we'll have a bit of a look at what's happened in other frameworks in Victoria and British Columbia. So what is the framework? The Treaty Act makes clear that the framework is to be developed through negotiation between the state and the Assembly. But the Treaty Act doesn't really give us a whole lot of guidance beyond that. It doesn't really tell us what should be in it, how it should be structured, how it might operate. There's 2 parts of the Act that deal with the content of the framework. That's sections 33 and 31. But if you turn to those, what you'll find is aspirational but fairly vague language. It talks about the framework recognising historic wrongs, helping to heal wounds of the past, and so on. All very nice words, but doesn't really tell us how to do that or what that might be. Other than that, it's got very basic process issues for inclusion in the framework. So a process for how negotiations will work, a process for formalising agreements, and so on. Of course, that process stuff is important, but it's not the meat on the bones of what a framework might actually look like. So to that extent, I think we have to turn to a couple of relevant reference points, and we examined 2. The first is the framework underpinning the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, and the second is the use of frameworks in the treaty process in British Columbia. So, the Settlement Act framework. Apologies. So the Settlement Act framework. So if you go to the explanatory memorandum for the Settlement Act, it talks about the Settlement Act as a framework for the settling of native title claims. So essentially the whole Act is a framework around how traditional owners can bring their claims, process them through this framework and resolve them. How it works is that the Settlement Act stipulates a series of contractual agreements, and together these contractual agreements will make up the framework. What those agreements deal with is firstly the formal recognition of traditional owners, the transfer of some land that the traditional owners have the option to receive back surplus Crown land or Crown land the state doesn't want anymore, joint management of national parks, TO rights in respect of the development and use of Crown land, funding, and traditional owner rights to natural resources. So that is rights to hunt and gather. That is essentially the framework set up by the Act, and any TO group entering into a settlement is required to enter into these agreements. These agreements have now been drafted, and they're generally what we refer to as the templates. Given that the templates, these agreements deal with land across the state. They're interacting with various different regulatory regimes. There's this implicit insistence on uniformity in this framework. And of course, the state requires that so it can continue to operate a cohesive land management system. However, what this means is when you have this uniform system across the state, is that it becomes very rigid. And that also means it becomes very inflexible. So that if any traditional owner group wants to change one part of the agreement or the framework, it needs to apply to everybody and therefore is inflexible. From the outset, this means that some things are not realistically negotiable in any individual traditional owner group negotiation. When a traditional owner group finally comes to sit down at the negotiation table with the state, they may find that the extent of their rights are already essentially predetermined, either by the terms of the Act itself or as agreed in a previous settlement agreement with another traditional owner group. And around those agreements, a whole bunch of policy has been written and implemented. Now, there's little incentive for government departments to alter their positions, and traditional owners, individual traditional owner groups, have very little leverage to get them to do so. Even if the state is willing to change a policy or position on something, it'll usually require the input of several government departments. It might require legislative change, and that's a process that realistically couldn't take years to resolve. The result is that you have this rigid framework, you have this unwieldy, bulky state that can't accommodate the differences and interests and culture that are represented by the many traditional owner nations. And effectively what you have is a framework that starts to mould all of the settlement agreements that it produces. And the settlement agreements are largely shaped by the framework itself. Now in BC, frameworks I think have really been used in two ways. The first is through something called the Claims Task Force report. So the BC process was designed by the Claims Task Force, made up of First Nations, the Canadian federal government, and the BC provincial government. So in 91, they released the Task Force report, which attempted to establish the scope and process of modern treaties. This, I think, is probably most analogous to what the Assembly is doing now in Victoria. They are designing an entire process and the scope of negotiations through this framework. Also in British Columbia, as part of their negotiation process, one of the steps, they have a 6-stage process. One of the steps in that process early on is to develop what's called a framework agreement. So these are basically, well, they're described as a table of contents of what will be in the final agreement. So all of the things essentially are given headings and listed, and then they're later to be negotiated on individually. So the approach taken in the task force report, so the sort of overarching structure, is pretty different from the prescriptive nature we see in the Settlement Act. It has 19 very broad recommendations about what people might want to negotiate on, things like self-government, financial compensation, rights over land, and so on. But even so, the task force report explicitly states that each party can bring any issue to the negotiation table which it views as significant. So the task force report is really at pains to avoid limiting the scope of negotiations. It says, here's a bunch of things people might like to negotiate on, but really you can negotiate on whatever you want. However, while the overarching framework is very open and unconstrained, there comes this moment of limitation through the framework agreement. And then every individual First Nation must sit down and agree to this table of contents. The intention at that time is to capture all of the items that are going to be negotiated through the process. While this is useful, I think it also this is I think when the rigidity starts to set in the BC process. These negotiations can take years. We see this in Settlement Act negotiations in Victoria. They take years, and over that period, the aspirations and priorities of the group can change. the political atmosphere can change. Groups that that are still in negotiations now under the Settlement Act did so before treaty was even a thought, you know, and through the process of their negotiations, the political environment in Victoria has really changed drastically around them. And no doubt the BC government faces the same issues as the Victorian government, and would like and insists upon a uniform system so they can run a cohesive land management system. So in practice, and I have heard this anecdotally from practitioners in BC, what you start to see is that the framework agreements begin to develop this formulaic quality that we see under the Settlement Act. And so traditional owners, although operating under a notionally very open framework, actually start to be quite constrained in what they can talk about. So all of this is to say, really, is to answer some of the commentary that was around at the time of the enactment of the Treaty Act, which kind of tried to suggest that the development of the framework is an administrative or sort of largely neutral process, and that it wasn't concerned with the content and character of eventual treaties. I don't think that that's correct. The framework is very clearly going to have to anticipate the type of treaty or treaties it hopes to ultimately produce. As we've seen with the Settlement Act, the framework has the potential to almost completely define treaties. So much so that I think it becomes difficult to draw a distinction between where the framework ends and the final treaty begins, because the treaty will be so influenced by the framework. And I think once you start to accept that, and you accept that the Assembly is going to bind negotiators, the framework really takes on a different character and can more correctly, I think, be thought of as starting to approach an overarching treaty document. Essentially, it is the first bargain cut between the state and Aboriginal people, and it should be thought of in that way. To that end, or extending that forward, we don't see why the Assembly couldn't essentially, you know, grasp that idea and adopt the framework as an actual initial and overarching statewide treaty. The advantages to this, there are a few. The first, I think, is that it seizes upon the political moment we're in now, where we have a government that is open to treaty and actively pursuing treaty. If we were to develop a framework that was something like a table of contents with the detail to be negotiated later, we can't be assured that a future government will be as open as the current one. That's not to heap praise on the current government, but I don't think it's going to get any better. Also, if adopted in this way, this would be Australia's first treaty. That's going to have huge political weight. It's going to have cultural significance for the general population, and it's going to make it much harder for future governments to ignore their promises or to dismantle the system. Now, obviously, and I'm noticing time here is getting away from me, obviously the Treaty Act as currently drafted is not consistent with the idea of the framework as a treaty, and the Assembly doesn't have a mandate from the Aboriginal community to negotiate a treaty. That wasn't the basis on which they were elected. I ultimately don't think this. I think these issues can be overcome. The framework could be negotiated as an in-principle treaty, and it could then be taken to a referendum of Aboriginal Victorians and traditional owner groups, and once endorsed, it could be entered into as a treaty. The state, of course, is not really confined by anything, and it can make an offer of an in-principle treaty to the Aboriginal community at any time. So in part three, we're really back to where we started at this model of a statewide treaty. As I said, it will establish the TRB as a sovereign body. provide Aboriginal control of Aboriginal affairs, recognise Aboriginal rights in law, and produce a framework for local treaties. This will, we hope, this model would we hope, incorporate all of the current spaces of Aboriginal political action in Victoria. For instance, ACCOs could be brought under the responsibility of the TRB. They would remain independent and acting as they are now, but those functions that are currently provided for them by government, such as funding and any sort of governance oversight, would now fall under the sort of democratic Aboriginal control of the TRB. In terms of traditional owner groups, they could use the TRB to collectively advocate for the expansion of their rights. I think this would lessen the rigidity of state processes when you have collective negotiation. The state, every time it negotiates with one traditional owner group and wants to make a change, has to make a change for all traditional owner groups. If traditional owner groups are on the same page, if they're supporting themselves, supporting each other through these negotiations, I think the system will be much more responsive to them. And finally, obviously the TRB is going to have a representative function. The fact that it's an elected body is going to give it a lot of political credibility, and it would really be able to support consultative processes. If the state was going to continue with binding, supposedly binding legal agreements in respect to policies, they could actually be made more binding through entering into an agreement with the state. So look, that's kind of the opening of this discussion. We will be in future papers, as you can see, kind of breaking down the different aspects of this model and examining them in detail. The next paper is on sovereignty in the Victorian context, which will look at this idea of recognising the TRB as a sovereign body. The paper 3 will look at in the recognition of Aboriginal rights and enshrining the UN DRIP in Victorian law, before we go on to look at transferring Aboriginal control of Aboriginal affairs, and finally a framework for local treaties. And that is the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope people are still out there. Did anyone have any questions or comments or feedback on the paper? Anonymous attendee, what are the greatest threats to treaty being completed in Victoria? Is there much chance it will be scuttled, or is it pretty foolproof? Well, that's a good question. What are the greatest threats to treaty in Victoria? I mean, I think the obvious one is a change of government. There is no bipartisan support for treaty, and a change of government would see it sink, I think, almost certainly. I think, I think also too, the state is yet to be tested on some of these Aboriginal aspirations, particularly things around sovereignty. They're going to be very tricky questions for the state, and who knows if the state is going to have the mettle to really step up and meet Aboriginal aspirations head on. And if it doesn't, I think the Aboriginal community will not sign up to a weak deal. So it's going to have to be good. Someone's telling me that the link to the third paper, UN DRIP, on enshrining Aboriginal rights is broken on the website. I will fix that immediately after this meeting, and it should be available for you there. No worries, Jessica. Will Aboriginal people be able to take back Crown land through treaty to do with as we please? Another really good question. So currently under the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, what traditional owners receive is rights over Crown land. So they have rights to access it. They can go on there. They can perform traditional activities on there. If the state is going to develop it or build a road, they get some say over what happens. But they certainly don't get to do with it as they please. It's not, those rights are not like ownership. Whether that's likely to change through treaty, I don't know. I don't think the land will be handed back entirely to Aboriginal people. I think that would be probably a bridge too far for the state. And this is one of the interesting comparisons too between, say, the BC process and what's happening in Victoria, because in British Columbia is huge, and a lot of the First Nations are still on their traditional lands, and a lot of those lands are essentially wilderness. So they have been able to get back control of it, and not just ownership of land, but like political rights and sovereignty over it. That's going to be much more difficult in Victoria because we don't have that wilderness. We are a sort of highly populated small state. So I don't know how that will work. The one proviso on that is we do have a lot of national park, and so that would be one area where I think traditional owners would be seeking greater rights and potentially sovereignty over those parks. What does that mean? I don't know. At the end of the day, treaty is always going to be a political settlement. It's going to be a political deal. The state government is going to have to sell this to the white fellas, and they're only going to sell to white fellas what's acceptable. They're not going to get voted out of office. Yeah. Michael O'Donnell, for the TRB to have legislative powers, presumably there will need to be Victorian legislation like self-government for the territories. Yes, there will. And exactly how that works, Michael, and all of the constitutional issues that implies, I'm currently investigating, and we'll get back to you in paper 4 about how that might work. How can a Victorian-based treaty influence anything that is typically in the Commonwealth's jurisdiction? It can't, I don't think. We are limited to state-based issues, and that's a problem. But I also think a lot of what Aboriginal people are interested in is actually dealt with by the state, and by that I mean land. All the Crown land is owned by the state. All of the management of that land is controlled by the state. I understand it's not ideal not to have the Commonwealth involved. Like in British Columbia, they have their federal government involved in their treaties. This process will not. That's obviously not ideal, but there is still interesting stuff on the table. From Andy MC, do you think the rigidity of the TOS Act and BC Framework Agreement is a reason for the framework to be minimalist and procedural to ensure flexibility in the future, or does it simply place more importance on the framework? It's a really good question. My opinion would be, I think my opinion is there's no point having a minimalist framework. If we have a minimalist framework, the crunch time is going to come at some point. And I think in BC, it comes when that individual First Nation is sitting at the table. And I think that's when they're at their least powerful. So I'm actually not opposed to a prescriptive framework, but it has to be good. It has to be strong. And I think part of that is why you want to embed it as a treaty. And it also has to have, because the treaty is a political document, it can be renegotiated. It's given a lot more weight than just a framework. But it will also have to include the ability for it to be renegotiated. But that is I think the essential question, Andy, is do you go minimalist or do you go prescriptive? and I think I'm on the prescriptive side, because I think the power that Aboriginal people have is now and is collectively, and if you go minimalist, you're going to have individual traditional owner groups up against the state, and they're going to have less success. That would be my personal view. Some really good questions there. I hope I answered them usefully. If anybody wants to take any of those questions up with me further, please just flick me an email and we can have a chat. All right, we're at 1:28. Any final questions? All right, I might, at that point, I might end the presentation. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for those really thoughtful questions. Our next presentation is on the, I better check and get it right. So our next presentation is on the 10th of February on sovereignty in the Victorian context. I hope you can join us then. And yeah, thank you very much for attending. Bye all.